Our next speaker is Dr. Zayna Khayat, and talk will be on the future of aging with health, dignity, and vitality instead of pain, sickness, loneliness, and dementia. Dr. Zayna Khayat is the future strategist at St. Elizabeth, a health and social impact enterprise with a major focus on home care. In 2017, Zayna was on a secondment from Mars Discovery District, an innovation hub in Toronto, to reshape Health Innovation Center at Radboud University Medical Center in the Netherlands. At Reshape Center, she was their innovation Sherpa-in-Chief, working on several key initiatives to strengthen the Dutch health innovation ecosystem. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Just so I know, I was intrigued by your questions, some of the gentlemen, and you're speaking on behalf of Bob. Who here is just an everyday citizen from this community? Okay, this is awesome. This is how I feel way more comfortable. And just to know, the reason I'm here, it all happened in a church basement in Elmvale. Her and I were at church on Mother's Day, and we went to the basement for like deviled eggs and, I don't know, chocolate Easter egg and eggs. Anyway, so then Michelle mentioned this day, and I said I really want to be here, so thanks for making it happen. Okay, so guys, we're taking a helicopter, and we're going way up. I'm a futurist. I scour the world for signals, and I try to figure out how to translate those to help this precious asset we have called healthcare. And so I'm about the future of health and how do we get Canada there faster, sooner, better, quicker, for the betterment of all of society. But we heard today if 2/3 of the population will be, older adults, therefore the future of health is the future of aging. So I'm going to talk about where the world is going in health. What are some big dislocations, some big shifts? And I want you all to be thinking about, wow, what if that applied to, the problems I'm trying to solve every day in whatever my work or my life is. I tweet incessantly, so I'm on, and I'll share these on Twitter as soon as I'm done, so you'll have these slides immediately. Okay, so who remembers Ptolemy, the mathematician? Yeah, kind of circa 0 BC, a little earlier. He kind of with his math was sure that the Earth was the center of the universe, and it actually didn't move. And he was convinced in that, and all the mathematical models that the sun and all the other planets are orbiting the Earth, that was the dogma, right? For 2,000 years, and that's kind of like, whether you want to say the creation of modern healthcare was 50 years ago, post-World War II, or, 2,500 years ago at the Hippocrates time, we've made the system the center. This thing, and institutions like buildings don't move, right? They don't change for a really, really long time. And the patients are this like unfortunate byproduct, that has to kind of circle around. And so just like Copernicus brought a revolutionary paradigm shift that through math, 1,300 years later, we had it wrong. The sun is the center of the universe, and the Earth is just one of many kind of orbiting. This kind of Copernican shift is what's underway right now. We're in the middle of it in healthcare, and this to me is the game changer, that we're finally designing everything about what we do around the people who have the biggest stake in all of this. And those of us who are in the formal system are one of many in the constellation that's helping, these precious people live and age healthy, among others. And so if you follow Thomas Kuhn's kind of scientific revolutions, where he looked at all these patterns, the Earth being flat versus round, although there's a whole society that still believes the Earth is flat, they don't just kind of gradually, like this 1,300 years thing, linearly, like the way healthcare, there's always like tipping point of major new science that allows the new paradigm because the old rules just don't fit anymore. Something's not working. And I would submit we have kind of 3 of these triggers happening. So the first, which has always been there, is, society's ability or willingness to pay does not match the demand, right, for all the things we just heard about today. That's always been true. That's been every headline of every newspaper, of every, every jurisdiction forever, right? But we're really at an acute phase of that, as we've seen in the discourse. Our solution historically was just, through taxation, just keep dumping more money on the system. But scarcity is a good time to innovate. But we couldn't do anything about that until the second big force, which is, this is Eric Topol's book, The Patient Will See You Now. He's a doctor, a cardiologist from Scripps, who's kind of characterize this patient revolution that you and I and our kids, if they're helping take care of us, have kind of all the cumulative knowledge of the world sitting here, right? So those other experts who had to train for 15 or 20 years to hold all that knowledge here, it's pretty democratized. We're empowered, and in many other sectors of our life, we figured out how to take care of things, right? So I talk about to my students, when I used to like to book a trip, I'd have to go with my mother to the back of the Sears store, to the travel agency. If my trip was a year from now, I had to order my traveler's checks then to anticipate how much cash I'd be spending, right? Like now, I could have booked my trip right now listening, but I couldn't because I was listening to him and it was awesome. So this is a new thing, right? We've woken up and we are demanding and expecting, let alone you layer if the bulk of us are baby boomers who have a very different expectation of aging than kind of the generation before them. But the third factor, and that's what I'm going to focus on, is even if we're out of money and we've all woken up and we're going to demand something different, there's now technology to actually do something about it at scale, right? Technology takes the trade-off of cost and what we want, and it brings it down to almost zero when that technology is software. And so just to give you an idea of this, right? So here's 2,500 years of medicine. These are major points from, Hippocrates. So microscopy, anesthesiology, x-rays, the World Health Organization in 1948, a major policy innovation. The human genome, etc. Major developments that really changed the equation of how we could approach health and wellness. Really important for some of those mortality statistics we heard. But the one thing that's been common about all of these until about 2008 is kind of when digital came on the scene in healthcare. And you guys remember this whole e-commerce wave and the internet was 99, 98, 2000, where every other sector kind of started to absorb and embrace this new channel for everything. We were about 10 years behind, which is pretty normal for healthcare. And then Canada tends to be 10 years behind everybody else in healthcare. So you now have a software layer that's underpinning all the cumulative progress, right? All the experience, all the knowledge, all the data can now have an information layer that allows that progress to now scale at a very low cost. That's the heart of what digital does to a largely analog system. So put that all together. This is kind of my framework for the future of health. It's kind of collecting all the signals around the world. I won't get into it. I do a 1-hour version of this normally if it's online. But these major shifts from reactive to not only proactive, but predictive. And I'll show you an example. From a precision that's kind of one size fits everybody, which means one size fits nobody, right? When you give everybody what works for the average, nobody's needs are met. Very crude, quite analog. We designed, medicine around body parts and diseases that we could see at the time that these institutions were created, to highly personalized and much more intelligent. A modality, so where we get services, very institution-centered, come to places like this or to the clinic. That was the orientation because we had to concentrate all these high capital and expensive and important resources in these places. All that is getting decentralized. From episodic and intermittent, we've designed medicine to kind of come in at the diagnosis point or the treatment point, and all that beautiful space in between is kind of where I left up to our own devices. So all that moves to being continuous, power shifting from the provider to what's now being called people-powered healthcare. Right? So it's not that we're in charge all the time, but it's much more of a partnership. And then a whole business model shift from paying for the appointment or the pill to paying for the result. Right? So this is a lot of change for a sector that hasn't really had a lot of change at this scale. And it's all kind of happening at the same time. And remember, software scales exponentially, so you now have a current that is going to make this way, way faster than anything we've seen in the past. So some of these shifts, just to show you a little bit. So I'm part of an international network of leading health systems that are trying to modernize formally through innovation, which is blowing up what you're doing now and putting it back together in a way that makes sense for today's needs. So we work a lot with these groups. So Kaiser Permanente, which is a major health system in the US, about the size of Ontario, These guys have to deliver care and do all the things we obsess about, but they've realized, same postal codes, two patients, two different postal codes, same healthcare system. If they're from Compton versus Beverly Hills, completely different outcomes, right? Postal code trumps everything else. So they've invested now in farmers markets in all their high-risk communities, city neighborhood building. They have a primary care plus model that will be published soon by Harvard, where primary care doctors are connected to all the social determinants, and they got incredible results for that. They just invested $200 million in a new financing vehicle for housing. To wait for government to subsidize housing, it's not going to work, right? So new capital sources that they've invested in, and this is a healthcare system. United Healthcare, same thing, housing, transportation, employment as their biggest social determinants, and it goes on. And even Women's College here in Toronto, a big platform of their strategy is to close the income gap, particularly for women, because income drives health, right? So healthcare systems are becoming social care systems because that's where the levers are. Other examples. So imagine this was the symptoms of kind of getting a sore throat and then getting that full-on flu or cold like you talked about. So, public health might have caught that a little early, maybe had some hand washing or made you take the flu vaccine. So maybe we would have caught it. If we missed all that, traditional primary care should hopefully catch it. But the reality is now all of us are creating what I call a digital exhaust. Right? All your activities are now digitized, whether you want it to or not. There's a digital twin of you being created all the time. Your movements, how you talk, how you socialize, where you spend your money, how much you move, blah, blah, blah. So there are now pretty sophisticated ways using artificial intelligence, which is just computers to process decision-making a lot faster and find patterns than we can do using analog methods, to start to do prediction much earlier, not just because it's nice, but there's now business models being created around the value of intervening here for healthcare instead of waiting till the sick care happened, right? Business models that are funded and everything are being kind of tested and evaluated. So we look at all of those. So you'll see quotes like this is the chief medical officer at the company created by one of the guys who cloned the human genome or sequenced the human genome, that this shift of medicine from being a clinical science that uses data to being a data science that's supported by many attributes that clinicians bring to it that are well beyond just the science and the data. So just an example, there's a new word on the street. This will be added to your research program. Digital biomarkers, right? We think of biomarkers as blood, weight, the basic stuff you collect whenever you get, a workup. Data from things like your voice, the speed, the words, the tone, the language mix, the urgency in your voice are now, RCTs are being published of predicting cardiac events, schizophrenia, suicide, and a whole bunch of other things. This data is free to collect, right? The biggest cost to clinical trials is all the infrastructure to go get all that data, right? Your face, just from pictures of children, they can predict genetic disease and stuff like that. So what does that mean for data when all our data is now medical data? Who gets that data? So all these questions are popping up. But digital biomarkers and like voice are getting big. So a couple of other shifts, this shift around decentralization. Okay, so folks, we've built a healthcare system on these analog beasts. Bricks, paper, pens, and the illustrious fax machine. There's a major debate about this right now. There's a hashtag called Axe the Fax. And then Andre Picard, I don't know if you guys read him, he's like my favorite writer in the Globe and Mail, just wrote another op-ed about this. It's all over the place. And so, pick a D. I think earlier we heard the 3 Ds. Who was that? Yeah, that was you. So there's more Ds. Let's add them to our list today, right? All of this is up. It's decentralizing, it's dephysicalizing or dematerializing, demonetizing. Demonetizing means we used to spend money on something that we don't need to anymore. I'll give you 2 examples. $1 MRIs. There's a company called Zebra Medical out of Israel that's now offering those for $1 to do the radiology scan, right, for the whole world. Your whole genome sequence right now is about $1,000. The Ontario government has had a committee to have a task force to have a committee to study whether or not we should sequence the population. They've been meeting for like 7 years. It'll be free in the next year because the business models will be created on the data, not on the cost to swab your cheek, put it in a thing, mail it, and put it through the sequencer. So massive shift. So this company, Babylon in the Netherlands, the NHS is the health service for all 65 million people in the UK. They are now partnering with them to deliver most of primary care virtually through an app, right? This takes care of 80% of routine primary care, and then that 20%, when you need the in-person, takes place in the clinic, and they free up massive capacity. They've scaled this to Rwanda. This company is moving to British Columbia this summer, and we're working with them to deliver primary care at scale in First Nations communities across Canada, because we're in 75% of them. Our First Nations communities will leapfrog the rest of us in having access to primary care on demand. 2 companies in Canada are doing this, Dialogue in Quebec and Maple here in Toronto, founded by an ER doctor in Toronto. World Economic Forum making predictions like the end of the hospital and the future is the home-spital. We say phone-spital. And that was certainly, this hospital is like the UHN of the Netherlands that I spent a year on secondment. You know, this is 15,000 people, the biggest employer in this small community in the Netherlands. And so it's like what Mayo Clinic is to Rochester. Had a futures team like me redoing the whole footprint. They will shut down half of their beds despite a 40% growth in demand because they have an older population and no job growth and no growth, right? Imagine going to your board in your community and say, yeah, we know it's going to go up by 40%, but we're shutting down half the beds because they're moving to a digital first, physical last model, right? Your precious assets here you use for the people who need it, and for those who are able, you deal with in other channels, just like everything else we've done in life. Biggest announcement, when they formed new government in October, they split the Ministry of Health into the Cure Ministry of Health, which is hospitals, and the Care Ministry of Health, which is elder care, community care, and primary care. Took $2 billion out of acute and put it into elder and community care. And nobody was pissed off in the press because it's kind of obvious. So other things in digital therapies, virtual reality. So this is where you wear a goggle and you're immersed in a new world. There's a center at Cedars-Sinai in LA with a Dr. Brennan Spiegel. He's like the U for dementia, for virtual reality. All RCTs to show better results as a therapeutic, a digital therapeutic, from immersing people with stress, anxiety, loneliness, depression. And now UHN is studying this for dementia, early stages. But better results, they now think medical school is going to need a new specialty called the virtualist, right? Just like we need clinical pharmacology and all these other things. The Netherlands has innovated on a completely different way to do home care. So no middle people, no coordinators, just let the nurses get in the field and solve what people need without all the chain of command. So my #1 project with St. Elizabeth, we're the same size as this organization in the Netherlands, Britsorg, we're 10,000 people, is to shift the whole home care model in Canada to a self-directed model where care teams make decisions on the ground and go back to why they got into nursing. So that's a big one. And then, other things, Red Cross, postal workers, firemen, EMS drivers now doing home visits, right? Because these business models don't make sense anymore. But postal workers are visiting the same house for 30 years. They know these people. They can do wound care, IV administration, et cetera. New ways to move people to appointments. So, we always talk about the Uber of healthcare, right? So on demand. Well, Uber is actually now doing Uber Health. So hospitals are hiring them to bring patients to and from appointments because there's so much turnover. Lyft is in Toronto. Ford Motor Company, talk about an industry that has to reinvent itself, is now a healthcare transportation company with a trial in Michigan. So other things, right? If you think of, anybody with a chronic illness that's, sleeps 8 hours a day, that leaves about 6,000 hours a year that they live with their illness and their disease and self-manage. And they're only in the formal medical system for appointments and checkups and labs, a sliver of it, right? So how do we tap that green zone in ways that can bring new resource to healthcare instead of the blue having to do all the work, right? So lots of movement in this area. Kaiser Permanente is now on a model that about 80% of what is currently done in the formal medical system can be self-managed by people in their communities at home for those who are able, right? Think of 80% of the Ontario healthcare budget could be transitioned, right, if we wanted to go there. All the things currently in a doctor's office or a clinic are being democratized into the phone, urine analysis, breath, eyes, you name it. It's all being done cheap, accessible, good enough to get early data, so you don't have to go in and make the appointment. All sorts of ways to track walking and urine and smart diapers, smart wheelchairs, smart bed sheets, to be able to monitor data and collect information all the time instead of at those kind of appointments, right? And we're testing a bunch of them here. And then finally, big shifts around how we interface and get information, particularly for the older population. Using apps and iPads, it's not easy. Voice will be the new way all of us communicate with anything. We won't be texting and touching and typing anymore. So health systems are getting way ahead of this. There's a major program at Kaiser Permanente for voice to be the #1 way any information is shared, whether that's charting, patient declaring their symptoms, etc. Amazon is all over this. We're doing a lot of work with a chat bot, so basically a text message that's smart and talks to you with a personality for the caregiver. So somebody mentioned the caregiver. We are all about supporting the caregivers. We have an entire business at St. Elizabeth just for caregivers. Robots in the home. I mean, Japan is 2/3 elderly population right now. Everything we're saying is coming, they're there, right? And they don't have big families. So they've figured out ways, and they have robots not just doing social isolation, but also vacuuming and stuff, new wheelchairs, reinventing the end of life, and more. So I'm just going to skip these so I can get to my point. So look, when software is at the table, like I said, things scale exponentially. And this is the challenge. This is why every health system is calling me, because they're like, Zayna, we don't know what to do with all this change. We still can't do scheduling online. So how are we going to deal with this? Because every one of these companies, who all of you are using all the time, has declared healthcare is either the #1 priority or in their top 5. Okay? Walmart will soon buy Humana, and they will be fully in the elder care space, primary care space, etc. So whether we as a formal health system want to get our act together, they're going to go there. They're going to go there with value propositions that are good enough, right? If my choice is no care, or I can get $9.99 a month for all my health care from Apple, which is coming, what am I going to do? Right? So either we're going to partner with these folks, or we're just going to kind of sunset away a lot of what we think we're trying to do, and then that's going to take over. And we're seeing that with all these examples. So the future of healthcare is innovation, and I encourage you to embrace these methodologies for innovation. And we're going to go through a workshop this afternoon to put you to practice in that. Thank you.